Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Independence Day at Adelaide Writers' Week. I'm very pleased to be chairing this session. It's very close to my heart, the rise of independent media. I'm David Washington. I'm from InDaily, Adelaide's independent news website. And your panel today includes three people who have been at the pointy end of the transformation of journalism in Australia. Before I introduce them, though, I'd like to acknowledge that we're on the land of the Kaurna people, custodians of the Adelaide Plains for countless centuries. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and future. We recognise and respect their cultural heritage, beliefs and relationship with the land. We acknowledge that they are of continuing importance to the Kaurna people living today. A few housekeeping issues. Please turn your phones to silent, but please use them if you would like to tweet or Instagram. The hashtag is #ADLWW. We ask you to support our authors and Adelaide's Writers' Week by purchasing books over at the book tent, and there will be a book signing at the end by one of our guests, Margaret, today. I'll talk to you about that a bit more later. And please be COVID safe as always. Follow the messaging on the screen and the indications in the garden. So today we have a lot to discuss. We are in one of the most interesting and sometimes confusing, I think it's fair to say, times in the history of Australian journalism. We have recently seen Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation style itself as the underdog, fighting against an evil duopoly that dominates advertising and has way too much power, while they've also been celebrating recently the golden era of diversity in Australian media. And in fact, we meet only a short walk from where Rupert Murdoch started his empire. His dad gave him the Adelaide News, cheeky afternoon newspaper.
Thank you, Adelaide.
Thank you. And of course, the rest is literally history. His influence on Australian life is under more scrutiny than ever, with former Prime Ministers Kevin Rudd and Malcolm Turnbull calling out News Corp's political influence in a way that serving politicians would probably never do. The former attracting more than 500,000 signatures on a petition calling for a royal commission. At the same time, independent journalism, I think, in Australia has never been more lively and indeed more doable, and yet we remain one of the least diverse media markets in the English-speaking world. And in recent days and weeks, we have seen the epic and increasingly complex battle between old media and the tech giants playing out. To discuss all of this, we have more than a century of media experience, if that's not too insulting. Both old and new, I should say, on the stage with us in alphabetical order. Peter Fray in the middle here. Peter is Crikey's editor-in-chief, has held that same elevated position previously with the Sydney Morning Herald and the Sun Herald newspapers. He's been the editor of the Sydney Morning Herald, the Sunday Age and the Canberra Times, and deputy editor of the Australian and the Sun Herald. He's got the full deck of cards there. In 2013, he started PolitiFact, Australia's first standalone fact-checking website, and now is in charge of one of Australia's original independent news and commentary websites. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
On my immediate left is Margaret Simon. Margaret is a Walkley Award-winning independent journalism author. Her most recent book, which is available in the book tent, is a biography of South Australian Senator Penny Wong. She is also one of Australia's foremost media analysts and has written extensively about journalism for many publications. She's also on the board of the Public Interest Journalism Initiative. Welcome, Margaret.
Thank you.
And at the end here, we have Michael West. He's worked for the big media companies, wrote a long-running column for The Australian. He's worked for the Sydney Morning Herald. He's worked as a business journalist and commentator for many years before striking out on his own in 2016. He publishes the independent, reader-funded site michaelwest.com.au, which has a stack of very provocative, interesting, well-researched journalism and he is a trenchant critic of the federal government's digital media code, and he'll have a lot more to say about that later. Welcome, Michael. So, Peter, I think I'll start with you. I was reading the introduction to Margaret's 2012 book, Journalism at the Crossroads, and one of the first things I came across was an anecdote about you resigning as editor-in-chief of the Sydney Morning Herald in the wake of the mass sacking of journalists back then. How do you make sense of your journey from the old media to the independent journalism? Or to put it another way, how different is your life at Crikey compared to the mahogany-walled offices of the executives at Fairfax?
Yeah, thanks. Well, when I was leaving, they were selling off the mahogany. They'd already sold off all the artwork, so there wasn't a lot of mahogany left by the time we left. Well, by the time I left Fairfax, it's been a remarkable journey, and the journey is ongoing. And I hope we can cover a lot of it in the next hour. What really has happened, of course, is the overarching understanding that the business models that supported Fairfax and News for so long, for a century. This is Rupert dive bombing us, I think, but they supported us for a century or more are over, right? And they were over around about 2010, 2011, 2012. One of the things we should never forget when we talk about the media code and the allegations that Facebook and Google stole the content, it was the Fairfax and News itself that basically had already gutted their own rivers of gold by setting up REA and Domain and all those things, you know, the real estate and the cars and all that sort of stuff. So, there is I know we're going to get to that. So the journey really has been about, a bunch of people increasingly trying to find a new business model to support public interest journalism. And that's one of the great disappointments, I suppose, of this code, but we'll get to that, as you say. But it strikes me that one of the great things that's happened is the understanding of the people who are here today, that this is the audience. You know, you are the audience for independent journalism. Thank you very much. Subscribe to Crikey. That's my plug. But no, in all seriousness, when I was, I've been a journalist for getting on for 40 years. For 30 of those years, I never knew the audience existed, really, because we had this thing called advertising. There were rivers of gold. I didn't have to worry about the audience. And then that all went away. And, of course, the first thing you do and the first thing that I wake up every morning thinking about is the audience, because if I don't have an audience, I don't have a business. And if I don't have a business, I can't do public interest journalism. It is that simple.
That's a really interesting point, Peter. And you make that too, Margaret, in that book. A long time ago, the death of the godlike editor. What has that held true, and what has replaced that?
Well, I've got two godlike editors on my left, so I should probably be a little careful. I think that the title of this session is "The Rise of Independent Media." Throughout my career, independent media has been both rising and falling at the same time. And I think that remains the case. I mean, some people here will remember the old Nation Review and other publications before, in pre-internet days. But of course, the issue now is that it's easy to put your stuff out there to the world. Gaining an audience for it, let alone getting that audience to pay, is more of a challenge. But that changes the whole ecosystem and changes the way in which people access their news. It changes, and this I think is a moving target, how we assess the reliability of news and who to trust. And all of that is, moving very fast, I think. So part of that is the godlike editor is no more. As Peter said, the issue is the business model, which used to be all about advertising. Now most serious media, through various means, gets about 50% of their revenue directly from the audience, either from subscriptions or from people just giving them money because they value the content. So if you look at The Guardian, they get over 50% of their revenue from people just giving them money, even though there is no paywall. The New York Times, about 50% of their revenue from subscriptions. Whereas for most of my career, it was about 80% from advertisers and 20% from subscriptions. So that's a massive transfer of power to the audience. And I think we have yet to see the full significance of that play out.
And Michael, your audience is particularly significant to you because your journalism is entirely funded by your readers. You eat most nights, do you?
Well, there are 10 of us now. We don't do fancy restaurants like back in the day at News and Fairfax when we all had expense accounts, but it's immensely satisfying. As Peter was saying, Margaret was saying, if you're funded by your readers, it's a terrific privilege. Funded by community, most people paying $5 or $10 a month. That's our thing. So there is no compromise with advertisers. There's no political or corporate agendas. We're free really just to try to tell the truth as we see it.
And those readers would hold you to account as well.
Oh yeah,
Michael.
absolutely, and that's valuable. I mean, it always has been. I've always had good reader feedback and some bad reader feedback, but that's good too. It's valuable. You know, they act as a good guide to what you should be doing.
And this is the double-edged sword, isn't it, of modern journalism, is it's only the new tech tools that allow somebody like you to create this platform from nothing, but it's also that new tech environment which washed away the old.
That's right. So the distribution that used to be chopping down trees and putting newspapers on the back of a truck out to rural Australia, that's gone. It's no longer economically viable, and so the big media organisations, as per the government's media bargaining code, are now being subsidised more than ever. We don't have those costs. Twitter, Facebook. When Facebook shut down, we get 100,000 traffic out of Facebook a month. So that was, for the few days, it was a little bit scary having no traffic there. But you've got other platforms too. So all these, and Google, of course, are the platforms, and they are essentially free. So that's how we get our product out there.
It was a sobering reminder of the control that those tech giants do have. We'll come to it later, the substantive issue, but sobering to see how much control they have over the distribution of information.
Though you have to make the point that we willingly, in terms of Facebook, we willingly put our stuff up on their platform. They don't take it. They don't. I don't get a knock on the door and say, Peter, hand over your content. I mean, we willingly do that. And it was a great moment when Facebook pulled the plug a week or so ago, because we had a massive increase in subscribers. I'm going to suggest to them that part of the new code is they pull it every 6 months, just so, things get a bit dire, we need to pay a few subs or something, we're going to pull Facebook off again.
Now, I don't want to get too bogged down in tedious definitions, but independent media is not a scientific term, is it, Margaret?
No, it's a loosey-goosey term. I mean, I think we all know, broadly speaking, what we mean by it. It usually means small, usually means not owned by Nine or by Rupert. But, nobody is independent of everything. No media outlet is independent of its proprietor. And so Michael West is not independent of Michael West. I mean, it goes without saying.
It's an existential crisis.
So, all media has a set of institutional and personal relationships and revenue relationships which have the potential to compromise the independence of the journalism. And, in the golden era, I lived through the golden era at Fairfax. I whinged all the way through it, I have to say. I didn't realise it was a golden era at the time. But, there were institutional arrangements which usually, not always, protected the journalism from compromise by big advertisers and by other commercial interests. Didn't always work, but it worked probably more often than not. I think a lot of those have been completely eroded at big media now, and independent media, have various affiliations as well, and you need to be aware of all of it and watch all of it, because nobody is purely independent. I mean, it's a sort of nonsense concept once you begin to think about it.
I think that while it might be difficult to tie up the concept with a bow, I think all of us who've worked in independent media know that the audience, if they see a piece of journalism that they know is not independent, they can identify that in a nanosecond.
That's true.
But what kind of forces is the independent sector up against in terms of just the day-to-day challenges of reporting in a truly independent fashion?
So, I think independent, we can play around with that word, and I'd be interested in hearing questions on that. The way I see it, the forces that rail against us is that essentially around influence. So there is a cosy relationship, mainly in the press gallery in Canberra, but other places, where between, if you like, the big players and those who feed off them. So there are reporters in this country, very well-respected reporters who live off of government drops and drips and all sorts of things, and that's the nature of their business model. So they become, in part, a propaganda arm for the government. Now, you might argue, I could easily argue, that that's a good thing, because if they weren't there, we wouldn't be getting that stuff. But at the same time, you could certainly argue vehemently against it. So for me, we're never on the drip. Sometimes I wish we were. But no, in all seriousness, I'm glad we're not. But it means that we've got to work harder, and we've got to think harder as well. I think if you're in the cosy bubble, in the same, there's a bubble in Adelaide, there's one in Sydney, there's one in Melbourne. If you're in that bubble, then you are in part a propagandist for who's ever feeding you that stuff. And it's what you do with that stuff is what some reporters just run it, and other reporters take it and examine it. But nonetheless, they are getting that stuff. We're not on the drip of any nature.
Michael, are those cosy relationships more common now than they were in the past? And is that due to pressures on the business model or something else?
Well, David, until recently, and I must say that the mainstream media has been very good, led by Samantha Maiden and the women in the Canberra Gallery over the rape cover-ups and so on at the moment. That's a departure from normal activity, because generally the Canberra bubble has got tighter and tighter and has been controlled more out of PMO, Treasury and Prime Minister's office, basically. The way it works is the drop on whatever policy is going to be announced tomorrow comes at about between 4 in the afternoon and 7 o'clock at night. Whoever it is, the correspondent for any of the major people in the press gallery, they write the story pretty much the way the government wants it. That sets the agenda for the morning television and radio people the next morning, who then follow that agenda. And by the time the detail of the actual, whatever it is, policy comes out, maybe the next afternoon, this is generalising according to different kinds of drops and kind of types of stories, but generally the 24-hour news cycle has been set, the agenda has been set in favour of the government. And basically it's press release one day early. Due to this increasingly corrupted system, it's allowed people like us to flourish because, media consumers are savvy enough to know when they're reading propaganda. And unfortunately, the mainstream media has increasingly served up propaganda. There's still very good journalists in the mainstream media. Unfortunately, the management typically is not nearly as robust as it used to be. The cultures, I've worked for News Corp for 8 years, many years ago, then Fairfax for 8 years. So the culture is broken in these places. I mean, Peter and I was Peter's business editor for a while at the Sydney Morning Herald. We went through something like 5 redundancies together. I mean, this was dramatic times. And of course, as the advertising revenues shrink, commercially, these operations become more dependent on their advertisers, so they get closer to the people that are paying them. So criticising, when I was there, we'd always get a bit of blowback from Qantas and Commonwealth Bank. Those were always the worst bullies. And so, Peter and I'd be sort of resisting the commercial, agendas as much as we could. They don't bother these days, really. I mean, everyone will hop on a story if it's already breaking, but the mainstream media won't go after large corporations. The ABC self-censors all the time as well. That has opened up an entire market that's enabled, due to community support, people like myself to continue to do journalism, because I was fired from Fairfax for the crime of journalism 6 years ago.
Not by me.
Not by one of the last great editors, but they did me a favour. They unwittingly did me a favour, and it's enabled now, thanks to community support, for me to be able to employ 5 people full time. So young people out of uni and so on. So that's been
extraordinary.
Been very satisfying.
Could I just make one endorsement of what Michael just said, because I just wanted, it's worth passing, because I know we're slagging off mainstream journalists here a bit. I think Sam Maiden at news.com.au and others, The Guardian, I've done great work on the Brittany Higgins story, and I know I expect a lot of people saw 7:30 last night. I thought Anne Connolly from the ABC on the Royal Commission was sensational. I thought that was a fantastic piece of journalism. So I don't want to, cast aspersions on, all mainstream journalists, because I've been there a long time and I know how hard it is.
Well, I wanted to ask you, Margaret, following on from that, some people do celebrate the damage that's been done to mainstream newsrooms, the big newsrooms, the big corporations, by this disruption we've had over the last 20, 30 years. But what are we losing? And can independent media replace those things?
The second question, I think, probably too soon to say, maybe. Certainly some of them. I think it's wrong to celebrate the decline of the mainstream newsroom. It's not because I disagree with what the gentleman on my left have said. I agree that the integrity is undermined in all sorts of ways, which I find personally very distressing. I think many of the problems, I'm tempted to say all of the problems, but I'll say many of the problems that the audience rightly perceives in mainstream media are caused by the lack of resourcing. Now, there is also a lack of leadership and a lack of integrity as well, but I think sometimes they suffer after the resourcing. So, for example, I've seen stories in The Age, I live in Melbourne, in recent days, which were wrong not in the facts, but in the context, in the pitch, and where, in my day, back in the golden era, there would probably have been a sub-editor who would have queried that. They were experienced enough, plentiful enough, senior enough to be able to question both editorial judgment and the facts. That doesn't happen anymore. Now, you may never know who that sub-editor is. They don't have their bylines on the stories. But Philip Meyer, a US journalism academic, did some terrific research back in about 2012, which said the thing that most determines audience trust in an outlet is not the talent of the investigative team, not the credentials of the editor, but the numbers of sub-editors employed. The people who check that the spelling of names is right, that the facts are right. Because once you've spelt somebody's name wrong and everybody who knows that person knows you spelt it wrong, you destroy trust very quickly, let alone getting the tone misjudged on a story. It's very easy to lose audience trust, much harder to regain it. And the thing which most determines audience trust is that system of checking. We all make mistakes, but it used to be sub-editors who prevented too many journalistic mistakes from infecting the public discourse. That is purely a resourcing issue. The sub-editors were the first people to go in those redundancy rounds, and they've never come back. And to the extent they're still there, they're junior and they're hard-pressed, and that sort of questioning of pitch and judgment and fact simply doesn't happen anymore. But independent media will do what it does very well, and we should certainly celebrate it and support it. Personally, I subscribe to just about every independent outlet in the country for that reason. But the institutional heft that allows you to consistently and over time take on the centres of power in society will always depend on revenue and on size, and we have to fix the problems with the business model in order to retain that in society.
I want to talk about the general health of the independent news sector in Australia, but to do so I think I need to mention the elephant in the room, and we've mentioned them several times before. So after years of, at best, trying to pretend that its independent competition doesn't exist, News Corp has taken a bit of a turn recently. So they're now presenting Australia's media market as some kind of paradise of diversity. In fact, the executive chairman, Michael Miller, told a Senate inquiry into media diversity last month that the industry was a picture of diversity, no monopoly. Yeah. Was he right? And if so, why is he saying it now?
Well, it's bollocks, of course. And the truth is, that News Corp, and to a lesser extent Fairfax Now 9, have trotted this line out when it suited them. It's not the first time they've done it. They've done it any time that their duopoly or monopoly is criticised. It's one of the reasons I think Kerry Stokes is allowed to own all the newspapers in Western Australia, just so Rupert can say, me, look at Kerry, there's one state where I'm not dominant. So, of course, it's bollocks. Yeah, did you want me to say any more about
Kerry
that?
and Rupert are quite
Kerry and Rupert,
friendly over in Western
frenemies,
Australia.
Frenemies over many years. Rupert, I wrote a biography of Kerry Stokes. I don't think it's in sale in the tent, but, they have circled each other and used each other over many years. welcome to each other. But yeah, no, it is rubbish. Australia, depending a little bit on how you count it, Australia has one of the most concentrated media ownership regimes in the world. You can look at circulation or you can look at revenue. There's a number of different ways to look at it, but the answer comes out the same regardless. Having said that, partly because you no longer have to cut down trees and toss them over fences in order to get an audience, it is now easier for independent operators to arise and to find their audiences, and that's a very good thing.
So, yeah, I mean, I don't know if I need to add any more than the word bollocks, but again, pure politics was the reason that was said. Pure politics, no other reason. To pretend that this is some sort of diverse... Here he is again. Media haven is utter rubbish. But, and I think we should also... again, I'm sort of, by nature, a very optimistic person, and I do think that willingness to pay for journalism, I'm increasingly seeing that. I mean, Crikey had a great year last year. Thank you, COVID. Thank you, Facebook, etc. Thank you, everyone else. There is, in this country, an increasing realization that if we are going to have diversity, we're probably going to have to pay for it in some way. I think the ABC plays an important part in this. The ABC, to my view, I mean, obviously, look, probably everyone in this under here are all great fans of the ABC, great users of the ABC, but nonetheless, we've all been brought up with the idea that journalism, quality journalism, is free because of the ABC. Well, I'm telling you, it's not free. And we need to start thinking, increasingly people are starting to think about paying for it. I'm not saying it's an either or. I know the ABC is under attack, and I think the ABC signing up to the code is problematic, as the Friends of the ABC have said. And we'll get to that. But so my point is, this is pure political play, what Michael Miller said, what Peter Costello said, because remember he's the chair of Nine Fairfax. There was a shed load of money, a pot of money, a lot less, as it turned out, than they thought. I mean, remember that news in Fairfax, the news is talking about $1 billion payout. You know, that sort of money isn't there. It's not going to be there. But, you know, it's never get in front of a media executive in a pot of money, right? And that's essentially what we saw. They would sell Dame Elizabeth, if she was still alive, for that money. God bless her soul.
It strikes me there's a bit of a conundrum here, though, in the state of media power in Australia. So we have Crikey, we have the likes of your site, Michael, we have Schwartz Media that runs the Saturday paper, we have Solstice here in Adelaide, and we run In Daily and in Queensland and some other sites as well. So people now have options. But it seems to me that News Corp somehow, despite the fragmenting of the market, appears to have more political power than they've ever had before.
Well,
how do we explain this?
Well, I think the nature of News Corp's power has changed quite fundamentally, and I think the political class hasn't fully caught up with this. I don't think politicians are fully caught up with it. So it used to be the case, used to be just a given, that you couldn't win political power in Australia, in any state, unless you had Rupert more or less on side. That's no longer the case, and it hasn't been the case probably for about 15 years. Rod Tiffin, another media scholar, has done a lot of very detailed work on this, analysing state elections, what the newspapers, Murdoch newspapers, were doing in each state and federal election. We saw it most recently in the Queensland election. Now, Queensland is a state where, as Kevin Rudd has said, every single newspaper is owned by Rupert. And they went hell for leather against Labor, and Labor had a good win. And we've seen that pattern played out in a number of state and federal elections over the last decade and a half. So that raw vote-pulling power has largely gone. But it would be a huge mistake to then say, well, Rupert's power is gone. Because the way in which it works now is by agenda setting, by deciding what is respectable in the public debate. Why is it still quasi-respectable to be a climate change sceptic in Australia, whereas you'd be laughed out of court in most of Europe? That's because the Australian makes it continually acceptable. Also, as I said earlier, I don't think politicians are fully caught up with this fact yet, and so they still deal with Rupert and deal with News Corporation in a way which they don't deal with other media organisations, and certainly not with independent media. And then the one to really watch at the moment is Sky News, which used to have a tiny viewership for their After Dark material, which for those of you who don't watch it is a series of right-wing commentators, largely drawn from the News Corp stable. Now, it does have a tiny viewership on screen, but Win Television, our regional television network, has now done a deal where they carry Sky News for free. So the whole of regional Australia is getting a very different media diet from you. The potential for fracture in our national politics is obvious. And also their social media following is rising exponentially and has very close connections with Trumpism in the United States. Now, that has all happened really in the last 18 months or so and is one to watch extremely closely. I am particularly worried about the fracturing of rural Australia from urban Australia, which, as we know, is already an issue in our politics and about to get heaps worse.
Michael, is it too simplistic to say that Murdoch sees that he's got such influence politically in Australia that he essentially chose this as the site for his grand, epic first strike against two of the most powerful companies in the history of the world, Facebook and Google?
Well, Margaret and I had a contretemps about this before we came up to this panel. I think the media bargaining code is absolutely disgraceful. Rupert, and to a lesser extent Nine, Peter Costello, etc., had been peddling this idea to the government, to anybody who'd listened to Rod Sims and so on, saying they're stealing our content, they're stealing our content. We do all this magnificent content, and look, they're stealing it, these terrible, nasty, big media giants. Nothing could be further from the truth. All Facebook and Google do is they link back, they provide an excerpt and a link back to the story that takes you to Rupert or the Fairfax paywalls. It's free advertising. It's like the old yellow pages, it's like indexing. They're doing them a favour. And yet the government has stepped up to the plate and done this ridiculous digital media code where they have said that Google and Facebook need to pay cash, essentially, to our media mates. These are fat, dying old businesses. They're corrupt old businesses. There's no innovation. Rupert hasn't paid tax in Australia for 6 years, probably a lot longer. These don't need public support. Now, the last leg in this sorrowful tale is that you'll be paying for it. It's not even Google that'll be paying for it. So Google has just gone, and Google Insider told me this when I said, how would I go getting some money under this? He said, it's not for you. This is protection money. We're just paying off the government's mates. Effectively, to be really cynical and take the next, just to get them through the next election.
Peter, are you the government's mates?
They haven't been made under the code. The code was enacted into law after these cash payments, most of them, were decided. And the last thing is, because Google will be claiming tax deductions and will probably set up a service fee agreement from an offshore entity, and Rupert doesn't pay any tax, these will be subsidised. We are paying Rupert Murdoch personally, all of us who pay tax. That is what is going to happen.
Anyway.
Google paid $100 million last year, which was $100 million more than the Rupert paid.
So at this point, I say Crikey has taken signed a deal as a licensing deal with Google through the News Showcase, and we're in discussion.
Daily has done so as well.
Well, let's all fess up. I'm not going to be that proud that I don't take the money, right? But Michael is right. It's not right that it was based on a false premise that the content was stolen. As I mentioned earlier, the revenues. The biggest shift in revenue was really when the News and Fairfax started their own, hived off the profitable parts of their business into REA and Domain and such like, and then they, therefore exposing the business model that was based on advertising. This is a continuum. This deal is all about is getting rid of a problem that crosses, of course. Remember the National Party, obviously that's an issue for regional Australia. So they had to find way of shoveling money into media. Look, on the principle of would it be wrong to take to any money that would support media? Yes, I'm all for it, but I think we should call it for what it is. Really, these are licensing agreements. What they are. This is a licensing agreement. We license a certain amount of our content to Google. When we get around to Facebook, we'll be licensing a certain amount of our content to Facebook. It's a licensing agreement, pure and simple. It's been based on a political game that has now gone on for 18 months, and the political game hasn't delivered what certainly Rod Sims, I think, hoped for, and others hoped for, which was a way of supporting diverse media, independent media. 90% of the money from Google will go to the main media players. 90% of about 150, 140 million. So do the math. There's not a lot left for anyone else. And Michael West isn't getting anything.
Well, I haven't actually asked for any, Peter, but I was told that were I to ask for it, I wouldn't get any. And in fact, Giles Parkinson at Renew Economy, that spends his life correcting Rupert Murdoch's toxic climate and energy coverage, he was just told, no, it's not for you either.
Well, I'll just start by a few declarations. It's a much longer story than 18 months. It goes back to at least 2001, when there was a convergence review which was looking at the rise of the digital platforms and how we should tax them and regulate them, and nothing was done as a result of that. The bigger context, it has been a very long while since Australia has had anything that you could grace with the name media policy. You'd probably have to go back to Tony Staley, the Minister for Communications in the Fraser government, who started community broadcasting to have anything called a media policy. Instead, we've had a succession of governments, both political colours, who have been about removing regulations that were inconvenient for the Packers and the Murdochs of the world. Now, in that context, this isn't in any way a tidy policy solution. It's not my preferred approach, and it's pragmatic, conceptually muddy, and imperfect legislation. Nevertheless, in this context, as the thing that is on the table at the moment that can see some revenue flow to public interest journalism, I support it, and I should declare the Public Interest Journalism Initiative, which I'm on the board of, has made submissions to all the various inquiries leading up to the events of the last few weeks, so I've had a long involvement with these issues. Now, sorry, more context, and I'm sorry this is a long answer. This debate has also had legs in Europe and in the USA, where there have been other attempts to try and get the digital behemoths to pay for content, usually using copyright law. Now, that's a pretty old idea. If you're going to profit from somebody's content, the idea that there should be an exchange of value, it's hardly radical, right? Those attempts have failed. Long story short, because copyright is terrible legislation, very weak and fuzzy around the edges. So Australia decided to take a different approach, which was to use competition law and the argument that there was an imbalance in market power. And that's why Rod Sims of the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission got involved and had an inquiry. One of the recommendations of that inquiry is that there should be a voluntary code. The negotiations for that failed because Google and Facebook wouldn't get serious. Now, it's true that it's worth something to media companies to have their content on Google and Facebook, but a substantial part of Google and Facebook's business model relies on them being able to carry that content. And you must know this yourself. If you do a Google search, the statistics say about half the time you'll be searching for something in the news. All right? And if you look at the top search terms on Google on any day of the week, you'll find that that is borne out. Facebook, it's probably not news content that takes you there. That's probably to catch up with your friends and family. But again, and there's good research to bear this out, you will stay longer on the platform and therefore be served more ads if there is news platform on the content. So Google and Facebook benefit as well. There is a flow of value in both sides. What's it worth and who's it worth more to? We don't know, because there hasn't been a market to work that out. And there hasn't been a market because Google and Facebook have refused to even begin negotiations. So in this untidy, pragmatic way, using the big stick of competition law, which is very powerful, the government has forced them to the negotiating table. Now, I've already said it's not my preferred approach. I prefer to just tax them and redistribute the income, but that's not on the table. Neither side of politics is offering that. I think in the long run, the flow of revenue to media will be relatively modest, because once the protection money side of it has dissipated, which it will probably within a year, the value on both sides will be argued over and the amounts of money will reduce. Of course, Rupert Murdoch dominates Australian media. Of course, Rupert Murdoch is getting most, but The Guardian has benefited, the ABC has benefited, I suspect Renew Economy will benefit in the long run as well. Independent media has also benefited, and that is as it should be. It's far from perfect, but nevertheless, I think it's an advance. In the long run, now that Google and Facebook have been forced to accept that they should pay for content, the next natural step is that they will start hiring journalists themselves and being the media. And that's what I think is the natural next step. I think that will take about 5 to 10 years to play out, and that will be a power that makes Murdoch look puny.
So can I...
Peter, yeah.
Well, I hate disagreeing with Megan. I don't... Because she's very smart, and I'm not. One thing that we shouldn't leave this room, this playing field, and not know, is that the money that's been assigned does not have to be paid to public interest journalism.
That's true.
So this money could be making Married at First Sight, right? And if you want to tell me that's a great pragmatic solution, I'm afraid I don't think it is a great pragmatic solution.
I agree, that's a big flaw in the legislation.
It's not just a flaw, it's a flaw the size of Adelaide Oval. I mean, really.
Well, no, because when you look at The Guardian and the ABC, both of which will get a substantial amount of money of this, The Guardian is a not-for-profit trust. All of that money will be spent on doing the journalism and on the superstructure. ABC has already committed to spending it on rural and regional journalism. These are significant things.
So just to talk about
yes,
the ABC for a second, Meg, because I deeply worry that the justification for giving the money to the ABC is so that the government can cut the funding of the ABC by saying,
well,
right? Isn't that absolutely what this government does?
That is also a worry and something we should keep an eye on. But the current minister has committed to not doing that, and we should hold them to that for the election.
They always commit to not cutting the funding, then always cut the funding. So they can't be trusted, obviously. And I think it'd be real folly for the ABC to take any money from Google. They don't need to be there. They just don't need to be. They've got their own distribution. They've got their own solid brand and everything. They don't need to be on Google News Showcase. Google News Showcase, like Google Cardboard and everything Google except for its advertising business, will be a failure because it's going to have rubbish on there.
Apart from
it's going to have, Daggy Dad ScoMo builds cubby house, First Lady Jen goes to Bunnings. That's what is going to be on Google News Showcase.
She's the conscience of the nation, mate.
The First Lady.
I think Google News Showcase is no more than a fig leaf that allows Google to get out of this political problem while saying that it's not acknowledging it should pay for content. Google News Showcase is really nothing, I think, at the moment.
And just another point to make here is that under this code, you have to be designated under the code. Neither Facebook or Google are designated under this code, right? So you have a law that applies to no entity at this point in time. I mean, go figure, right? So this 20-year journey that Meg has talked about gets us to a point where a law doesn't apply to the very people it was designed to apply to.
We're going to open up to questions in a few minutes. So if you've got some brewing, let them come to fruition. But it strikes me that, irony is the sort of defining principle of modern politics, isn't it? But in this case, Margaret, competition policy was used at the behest of News Corp and Nine Entertainment.
And Guardian.
And The Guardian. Mm-hmm. In order...
And Seven. Sorry, carry on.
Will the chickens come home to roost in terms of the domination of these players of the Australian market in a regulatory way? Or is that structurally impossible because of the patronage of Australian politicians to these media proprietors?
Oh, look, I think it's a very fast-moving field. I also think the answer is different for Google and for Facebook. We tend to be talking about them in the same breath, but in fact, I think the business model is different and the trajectory is different. There is a larger question here about how we regulate these weird entities, which are a mixture of publishers and utilities and tech companies, data companies, basically. And we've seen that dilemma in the States. Only a few years ago, I remember having a huge argument on one of these platforms, Michael's got nothing on them, with Google, in which they were saying, we're not publishers, we're not responsible for the content on our platform. And then in the last few weeks, we've seen Twitter and Facebook and so on accept that they are in part responsible and take down some of the rabid QAnon stuff and Trump and all that sort of thing. So, it's a very fast-moving field. They have now effectively accepted that they are publishers. And that will be followed throughout the world, which is basically following aspects of the Australian approach. And I think that as they move more into that acceptance, as I say, they will suddenly think, well, why are we paying media companies? We can just do this ourselves. And that will be one to watch.
We have questions queuing up, so let's get straight into it. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you. Michael, I wanted to get you to explore a bit further a comment you made about self-censorship in the ABC. We know the ABC is under enormous financial and political pressure from the powers that be. Can you give us a little bit more information about that and where you see that going?
Well, thanks for the question. It's mostly anecdotal because I've got a few mates at the ABC, you know, people that I've known for a long time that I see around the place, and it's no secret that they're under a lot of pressure from the government. There's that idea that unless you play ball, we'll cut your funding. That hangs over them like Damocles' sword. Then you've got News Corp carping on about the ABC the whole time. So they're under a lot of pressure. I find in my area, ironically, it's benefited me a lot because they don't like to mention corporate names. You know, I can go out and call Exxon a tax cheat, which I often do, just those words, no problem. They're not going to sue me, they're too big to use the defamation laws. The ABC won't do that because it knows that if it starts making these sort of comments, honest comments, about these kind of big players, they're going to be tied up in their own red tape. They've got a complaints process, internal complaints procedures. There are people in ABC management that have to report to the next people up. They're all under pressure from the government. And the last thing they want is to have to deal with a whole lot of complaints from very large corporations. And so they deliberately just don't. And we saw what happened to Emma Alberici. The vast amount of her work was correct when she criticised Qantas, etc., for not paying much tax. So we saw what happened to her. That was basically the end, you know. Not only Qantas and the corporates came after it, but also the government. And so self-censorship, it's quite an insidious thing. People going, oh, if I do this, well, you know, am I going to put my own career under pressure? I know with the water stuff, the excellent water coverage the ABC did, they came under a lot of pressure from that. I could talk forever on various specific cases, but I wouldn't want to get anybody in trouble for blabbing within the ABC. But yeah, self-censorship is the thing there that really is. I mean, we personally benefit from it in terms of audience, but it's not good for the public interest. And the other thing is, of course, that they haven't, in business sense, they don't spend much business coverage anyway. But yeah, self-censorship, I think. Peter, you got any?
Oh, no, I think you've nailed it.
Yeah.
Sir.
I'd like to ask the panel, what do you think is going to happen to the media landscape when Rupert passes it his cheque probably in the next 4 or 5 years? And will that mean the demise of the Weekend Australian? And what will we read on Saturday mornings with our coffee?
Well,
that's where I got a lot of my information from, and I think it's going to be very significant.
Well, I think Lachlan is more right-wing than Rupert. So there goes Saturday morning for you.
But also less clever, a lot less clever.
But Margaret, for whatever Rupert's perceived flaws, he loves newspapers.
Yes, yep, and you know he loves them for a mixture of profitability and power, probably more power than profitability in recent decades. You know, Lachlan, I know that a biography of him has been commissioned recently by publishers standing up the back there. So we'll learn more soon. But my impression is that Lachlan is nowhere near as smart as his father, certainly at least as right-wing, but not necessarily as committed to news media. So it will be interesting to watch what happens. Also, I suspect the other shareholders in News Corp may discover some spine once the old man goes.
If I could just be less glib, I think the question really for news, if it's possible, but for news is the influence, and it's impossible to measure the political influence of, say, a newspaper. You can't put a number on it, right? But it is true, I think, that the Oz creates policy outcomes that align with the Murdoch business. Now, so that in and of itself is of great value. So I really think the Weekend Oz will be around for quite some time.
Thank you.
Yes.
Do you think like the With the next election coming up, do you think guys like Michael West, Crikey, Friendly Geordies and that, do you think they have the power to swing the next election towards Labour or...?
No.
I think they probably do. I mean, it's all... Friendly Geordies is a classic case of a confluence of the things we've been talking about. Here's a guy, he's about 28 years old. Fiercely independent, very pro-Labor. He's certainly not apolitical. He's got almost 500,000 people subscribing to him on YouTube. I mean, that's an immense audience. Now, the Herald Sun used to be the biggest daily paper in Australia with about 400,000, I think, and that's probably, I don't know, Margaret would know, but down to about 200 now, something. I mean, they're all falling away very quickly, these mainstream things, compared to YouTubers and so on. That is huge growth. And I think independent media will end up putting traditional media to the sword if this government stops subsidising them. I mean, there's things like the $30 million cash gift to Foxtel to cover women's sports, and then the ABC has to pay them money to buy it off them as well. You know, these kind of subsidies and the change in takeover laws that allowed Nine to take the Fairfax and so on, if the government waiving licence fees the whole time and things like that, there is just one mate's deal after another, finally culminating in this ridiculous digital media code. If they stopped subsidising these old businesses and left it to independent journalism and perhaps changed the defamation laws, because my biggest risk, I'd say, the existential risk, is being sued by some defamation ambulance chaser. So...
or a federal minister.
Or a federal minister.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I've actually been quite passionate about this news media bargaining code issue for quite a while, as soon as it came out. And my first thoughts were basically exactly the same as Michael's, as in, companies like Google having to pay to show links to other websites. I don't see how that... the example that I saw, a similar modified version of an example that Google gave, being that of... maybe if I were a travel agent that gets paid money, should I have to pay companies or services like hotels that I might be recommending or aircraft carriers, should I have to pay them to recommend them? Because that seems like what's going on. And I don't quite see why the code is structured in the way it is. So, for instance, if I were an advertiser if I wanted to advertise on Google, I get paid per impressions. Should something with the news maybe be something but the other way around, as in for every news article that's shown, that person gets paid? And should anybody who identifies as independent news, such as Michael West, why would they be excluded from such a...
Yeah, I think this is an interesting point. Margaret, would it break the internet if this was applied to other industries?
No, of course not. And, I think the whole claim that it was going to break the internet, which lasted for about 5 minutes until Microsoft Bing said, well, we'll do it, and Google suddenly got real. But, your argument is one of the reasons why, if I was leader of the world, I would tax the buggers and redistribute the income. But that is not on the table, and the situation of public interest journalism is dire. Absolutely dire, and I think that matters an enormous amount. So that's why I'm prepared to accept the pragmatics.
I think either myself or Michael should give you a column.
Yes. Hit them up afterwards. Thank you. You have to do it for free, of course.
Yeah, it's for free. Yeah.
Thank you.
Come closer. Thank you.
Hi. I'm a great podcast fan, and I listen to a lot of investigative journalism on podcasts, and you've already mentioned YouTube. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about moving forward. Do you think that podcasting and that type of thing, which is in a way quite relatively cheap to produce, will that gain a larger section, do you think, of the marketplace?
Yeah, I think it's enormously important. It has reinvented Radio National, if we're talking about the ABC, and the way in which they reach their audiences. Just about every young woman I speak to, including my daughter, listens to Shameless and is hugely influenced by what those young women do. And, you've got things like 7am, which the Schwartz people put out, or the Saturday paper and so on. So I think that's huge. And if I can just pick up on the earlier point about whether independent media can turn an election, I don't think necessarily, unless Michael or somebody gets the, the Watergate scoop or whatever. But I think there is a whole ecosystem around the way in which people absorb news these days. And we've seen it very powerfully in Victoria with Dan Andrews standing up every day and doing a great long media conference and people watching it, watching the whole darn thing, including how the journalists behave and largely being pretty unimpressed with how the journalists behave. And that sort of thing, I think, is, more powerfully affecting the way in which people assess their politicians than probably anything any journalist writes.
Thank you.
Hi. My question is for each of you individually, what you think the biggest existential threat is to freedom of information right now, in terms of what we can do and prioritise as supporters of independent media, as active participants in politics, as eligible voters. What do we prioritise?
Yeah,
Excellent
so
question.
many things, so many things.
We've got 5 minutes. I'd love to
Okay.
get to the next two questions
I'll
as
be
well.
very
so
quick.
Sorry.
It's a good question.
Support defamation law reform. Australia has some of the most restrictive laws in the world, possibly the most restrictive. Pay for journalism, either through your taxes in supporting the ABC or by supporting independent media. This whole idea that you don't need to pay for news is bollocks. Basically, if you want good news, you're going to have to pay for it one way or another.
I would add to that, we are incredibly, I'm sure this audience isn't, but as a general mass, we are an incredibly acquiescent society. And we put up with a lot. We ignore a lot of low-level censorship in this country. There's a raft of security laws and what have you that are a threat to freedom of speech. Defamation, obviously, but again, go back to the willingness to pay. I would say one other thing quickly about independent media, and the big challenge for independent media is that it risks the same problem that people say Facebook is, which is that it's a bubble and you're only talking to people who agree with you. And that's lovely, we're all agreeing with each other, but if independent media is going to change things and challenge things, then it has to speak to the people who don't agree with it. And that is the fundamental premise of journalism. We should have no friends. In fact, I have no friends. And that's so job done. But seriously, journalists, if you want a friend in journalism, get a dog. I don't want to be liked. I want people to read what we do and independently act on that. I mean, we are people who give you information for you to act upon. So I guess fundamentally, it's kind of being passive. I think this society, we are a little bit too passive, and we need to get engaged in politics. We need to write letters to our MPs. We need to demand shit. And I love your T-shirt.
Thank you.
I just say that the forces are inexorable. It's happening anyway. We're going to come out of this COVID situation in a K-shaped recovery, so that people with assets and houses and so on will do better. And there's going to be a lot of disenfranchised people. Inequality has been on the rise for many decades now. That will only grow worse unless there's a radical change in policy settings and a departure from neoliberal thinking and policies. There really has to be, if you look at the gig economy and just there has to be another creed, another economic political creed. This isn't working at the moment. There has to be either universal basic income or
Yes.
I favour it's great to see support for that because it has to happen. This gig economy and if you look at the stats, they're saying the jobless rate's 6%. Well, that's just absolute nonsense. People working different jobs, and with AI coming in, underemployment is just going to be worse than ever. Gig economy, AI, it's the haves and the have-nots, that can only get worse unless there's a radical departure. And I favour job guarantee over UBI, but they're in the same ballpark. Otherwise, we're just going to have a massive disenfranchised population, and it's going to be very negative for the social fabric of Australia.
Yep.
I'm afraid thank you, Michael. I'm afraid we're down to our last minute.
All right, it's going to be really short.
So hit me up very quickly and we'll answer very quickly.
What is the relevance of ACMA? on the basis...
Excellent question.
On the basis that the Hills Radio got a temporary licence 6 years ago. 4 years after that, a second temporary licence was given. In the middle of last year, ACMA asked both of the radio stations to answer a series of questions, which they did. ACMA took away Hills Radio's licence, even though it has 72 regular presenters and regular programs. The second licence has loop music and recorded interviews and the merest semblance of some local content. ACMA said the reason was they didn't like Hills Radio's constitution.
Okay.
Well,
ACMA, soft touch regulator, not completely ineffective. We're probably better off with it than without.
ACMA's a product of its legislation. The legislation is buggered. It's not ACMA's fault in that sense. And I'm sorry about Hills Radio. I bet you're a great presenter.
Listen in on Thursday.
I think we're going to have to leave it there. People are passionate about local media, which is good to hear. Thank you all for coming out and listening to us. Let's thank Margaret, Peter, Michael. Margaret, unlike the rest of us, has written some books, so she will be available to sign books. Her biography of Penny Wong. She's also got a quarterly essay about the Murray-Darling Basin. Thank you very much.